Why Taurus energy calms or triggers the sensitive mind. There is a very specific kind of shift that happens every year, and in 2026, this shift begins around April 19th. From that point on, something in the overall pace of life starts to change, almost without explanation. The energy becomes heavier, more physical, more focused on what is directly in front of you. And this continues for several weeks until around May 20th, creating a very defined window where the nervous system is invited into a completely different kind of experience than the one that comes before it. Most people describe this shift in simple terms. They say things feel slower, more grounded. There is more focus on comfort, on food, on the body, on routines. And for some people, this feels deeply calming, like something finally settles, like the nervous system can land in a way that was not possible before. But for others, especially highly sensitive or neurodivergent minds, this same period in 2026 can feel unexpectedly uncomfortable, not chaotic, not overwhelming in the typical sense, but strangely intense. As if being in your own body suddenly becomes louder, as if everything physical becomes more present, more noticeable, more difficult to ignore. And what makes this even more confusing is that nothing externally seems to justify that feeling. The world has not become more chaotic. If anything, it has become quieter. And yet, internally, something has intensified. This is what we call Taurus energy. And what is rarely talked about is that this energy does not affect all nervous systems in the same way. In fact, for complex, highly perceptive minds, this period is not simply calming, it is amplifying. And depending on how your system is currently regulated, that amplification can either feel like relief or like pressure. Taurus energy is often misunderstood as something soft, slow, even passive. But that is not actually what it is doing. It is not removing stimulation. It is not quieting the world. What it is doing is shifting the focus away from the mental layer and into the physical one. It slows down the pace of processing, but at the same time, it increases sensory awareness. It brings attention to texture, to temperature, to rhythm, to repetition. It brings you into contact with your body in a way that is harder to bypass. For a nervous system that is already overloaded with input, this can feel like too much, not because there is more happening externally, but because there is less distance from what is already there. You feel your body more clearly. You notice tension more quickly. You become aware of subtle discomfort that you may have been able to ignore before. And for many neurodivergent or highly sensitive individuals, this can create a sense of restlessness or irritation that is difficult to explain, because on the surface, nothing is actually wrong. At the same time, if your system has been in a state of constant mental overstimulation, this specific period in late April and May 2026 can feel like a deep exhale. The reduction in speed allows thoughts to settle. The repetition creates predictability. The focus on the physical creates a sense of containment. And suddenly, instead of being pulled in multiple directions, your attention has somewhere to land. This is why some people feel significantly calmer during this window. Not because the world is quieter, but because their nervous system finally has enough structure to process what is already there. In Kabbalah, there is a concept that helps to understand this more clearly. It is the idea that energy moves from abstract into form. that something that exists as potential, as movement, as emotion or impulse, eventually needs to become something tangible, something grounded, something that can be held or experienced directly. Taurus energy lives exactly at this threshold. It is where movement becomes matter, where experience becomes physical. But in Kabbalah, this movement into form is not random. It follows a very precise structure. Energy does not simply become physical all at once. It moves through layers of refinement, contraction, and organization until it reaches a point where it can exist in reality without dissolving, and Taurus represents a very specific moment in that process. It is the point where expansion has already happened, where ideas, impulses, and emotional movement have already passed through the upper layers. And now, instead of continuing outward, everything begins to slow down and take shape. This is why it can feel heavier. Not because something is wrong, but because energy is condensing. In the structure of the tree of life, this can be understood through the relationship between Netzach and Malkuth, and also through what happens between them. Netzach carries movement, desire, sensory engagement, the experience of life as something flowing and alive. It is where we feel, where we are drawn toward experience, toward connection, toward sensation. But Malkuth requires something different. It requires boundaries, form, containment. It requires that something becomes stable enough to exist in reality. And that transition is not always comfortable, because what is fluid has to become defined. What is open has to become structured. What is potential has to become real. For a neurodivergent or highly sensitive mind, this transition is often where tension appears, because these systems tend to be naturally oriented toward pattern recognition, abstraction, and continuous input. There is a tendency toward movement, toward expansion, toward taking in more and more information. And Taurus interrupts that pattern. It does not ask for more input. It asks for integration. It asks for repetition. It asks for staying with something long enough for it to become stable. And from a nervous system perspective, this is exactly where regulation either happens or breaks down. Because regulation is not created through constant change. It is created through predictable structure, through rhythms that repeat, through environments that do not require constant adaptation. In Kabbalistic terms, you could say that expansion and contraction have already moved through the system. What remains is the need to stabilize that movement into something that can actually hold. And this is where many sensitive systems struggle. If there is not enough structure, the system keeps searching. If there is too much structure, the system feels trapped. So Taurus becomes a balancing point. Not between fast and slow, but between movement and stability, between experience and embodiment. And this is why the same energy can feel completely different depending on your internal state. If your system is lacking structure, Taurus feels like relief. If your system already feels constrained, Taurus can feel like pressure. And neither of these experiences is wrong. They are simply showing you where you are in relation to form. And this is also why the timing matters so much, especially in 2026, because between April 19th and May 20th, the external environment naturally reinforces these qualities. There is more light, more warmth, more sensory richness in the world around you. Nature becomes fuller, more tangible, more textured, and that means your internal experience is also amplified in this very specific direction. For a regulated nervous system, this creates stability, it creates rhythm, it reduces the need for constant decision-making. But for a dysregulated system, the same structure can feel restrictive. The repetition can feel irritating. The slowness can feel like being stuck. And the increased sensory awareness can become overwhelming because instead of moving quickly past discomfort, you are now sitting inside it. This is where many people misinterpret what they need. When this energy feels uncomfortable, the instinct is often to add more grounding, more stillness, more presence. But if the system is already overloaded with sensory input, that only increases the pressure. It is like turning up the volume on something that is already too loud. So the question is not whether this energy is calming or triggering. The question is how your system is interacting with it. If you feel calmer, more present, more settled, then this is a time to lean into repetition. Simplify your routines, reduce decision-making, create structures your system can rely on. If you feel irritated, restless, or uncomfortable, then the approach needs to shift. Instead of adding more stillness, you may need movement. Instead of increasing sensory input, you may need to reduce it. Less noise, less visual input, more space. And one of the simplest ways to work with this is to ask a very direct question. Does my system need more sensation or less? If the answer is more, you move towards stable, predictable sensory experiences. Nature, warmth, slow movement. If the answer is less, you reduce input and allow your system to settle. What matters is that you are not forcing calm. You are adjusting input. Taurus energy, especially in this 2026 window, is not about slowing down for the sake of it. It is about creating enough stability that your nervous system does not have to constantly adapt. It is about allowing experience to become structured enough that it no longer overwhelms you. And instead of asking whether this period should feel good or uncomfortable, you can approach it differently. You can see it as an annual window where embodiment becomes more visible, where your relationship to the physical world becomes clearer. And from there, you make small adjustments, subtle shifts, enough to support your system without forcing it into something it is not ready for. Taurus is not about being slow, it is about being stable enough to stay present, and for a sensitive or neurodivergent mind, that is something that has to be built carefully and intentionally. If this way of understanding energy, structure, and the nervous system resonates with you, this is exactly what this space is for. Not more noise, not more information, but a way to create clarity, stability, and depth in how you experience your life.